Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. In this episode, we're going to pick up with the theme that we were looking at the past couple of episodes and develop it a little bit further. You might recall that we have been looking at numbers, and we carried out a countdown from 10 down to 1 and looked at the histories and etymologies of the number terms in English and in Indo-European. But as you may have noticed, we left some numbers out. We didn't do a lot of numbers that you may be interested in. So in this episode, we're going to kind of complete the circle and look at a bunch of other numbers that some of you may be interested in, starting with a very important number to most countdowns that we did not look at, and that's the number 0. Why did I not talk about the number 0 in the countdown, even though countdowns usually end with the number 0? Well, one important reason is that Proto-Indo-European and all of the ancient Indo-European languages lacked a number 0. They just didn't have this number. How is it possible? How is it possible for a culture to not have a number 0? Were they weird? Were they just lacking in some way? The answer is actually not really. Most cultures throughout human history have not had this number and have struggled to even develop this concept. It seems like this number was developed primarily in one particular place and time in history, and that was the Indian subcontinent, starting a little over 2,000 years ago, but really reaching its full development about 1,500 years ago. And yes, there were a few other cultures that sort of tiptoed up to this idea in various ways, but it was really on the Indian subcontinent that the number 0 achieved its full flower of development, if you want to call it that. And it was fairly recently, okay? It was after the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome when this really got developed in India. How did this number make its way to Europe? Well, it made its way to Europe through the Arab empires of what we call the Middle Ages, because they stretched from Europe all the way to India, and they served as a kind of conduit for ideas to flow between. You may know that we call our numbers, like the number 0 that you see on your screen, Arabic numerals. That's because the Europeans got them from the Arabs, but the Arabs did not actually invent them. They got them from India even further east, and that includes the number 0. So the number 0 flowed through the Arab empires of what we would today call the Middle East from India to Europe and got there by the Middle Ages. But it was a fairly recent development in Europe and in Arab regions, and even not that old, not super antique in India either. So there's some fascinating history there that you can go look at if you want, although that's not our primary focus here. It came into Europe first to Italy, because Italy is on the southern periphery of Europe and had a lot more contact with Arab regions than points further north. So the number 0 came to Italy, and then it spread to France, and then ultimately it spread to England a little bit later in the Middle Ages. Where do we get the word 0 from? It actually comes from this Arabic word "sifr," which just means empty or null. It's the empty number. It's the null number. It means nothing, right? It's not actually a particular quantity at all. That's the number 0, right? That in turn was a translation from the original Sanskrit term shunya, which also meant empty or null. So the Arabs essentially translated this word shunya into Arabic, sifr, and then we, Europeans, Italians, French, English, borrowed this Arabic term instead of translating it like they did. Theirs was a translation from the original Sanskrit. We actually just borrowed their term. And ultimately, that is where our word 0 comes from. But it's pretty recent. It does not stretch back thousands and thousands of years like some of these other numbers that we have been looking at. All right, so we've dealt now with the number 0. Let's start counting up from 10. Since we've already looked at 1 through 10, let's go to 11. What about the number 11? There's some fascinating history behind the number 11. As you can probably guess, this one was not borrowed into English or European languages in the Middle Ages. This one's been around a long time. This goes back to Old English. This is a native Old English compound, and leovon is something, it would have been pronounced something like that. And we can break this down into 2 parts. N is 1. If you think back to the last safari, we were talking about the number 1. It looked like ein, en, on. The vowel could change, but it had the N there. So the N part is the number 1. And the second part, leov, actually is cognate with our word left. So when you put these two things together, put these two words together, what the number 11 literally means is one left over. Now, why would the number 11 have anything to do with one being left over? Well, think about it. If you're counting to 10, but you really want to count to 11, you get to 10, and then you have one left over to get to 11. That's really all 11 means. So it's pretty fascinating when you break down 11. It actually means something. It's not just a random sequence of sounds. It actually means one left over. By the way, in case you're wondering, wondering, that D between the N and the leovan is what we call an excrescent consonant that sort of just grew up in the middle to make it easier to pronounce the N and the L in succession. So that's not actually really part of the etymology. What about 12? 12 has a similar parallel history to 11. Also goes back to Old English 12. Very similar. Tway is two. We talked about twain being one of the old words for two in Old English. And the luf, there's no vowel there in the middle anymore, but the luf is also cognate with left. So 12 means two left. And so it's, again, a very similar etymology to 11. It's two left over after counting to 10. So 11 and 12 both really go together, and they both developed in a similar way. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go to 13. As we know, 13 is the number after 11 and 12. And as you can probably tell from the way it looks, this does not share a history with 11 and 12 because it doesn't have the luf or luv part at the end. So there's something else going on here with 13. Now, if you just look at 13, I don't know if you've ever looked at 13 or 14 or 15 or any of the teen numbers before, but if you just look at them, you can probably actually get an idea of where they come from, at least part of it. So the first part, as you can probably guess, the third part, all right, comes from another number, 3, because there's something 3-ish going on in 13. The Old English word is threotain, hasn't changed that much, and the threo part meant 3. Now this is where we get the third part in 13. Something has happened called metathesis, which means two sounds switching places, so 3 became thir, probably just because people thought it was easier to pronounce, but the thir is still 3, even though we have switched the I and the R. It's still the same word. Okay, that's the easy part. Now look at the second part, the teen part, and this is the part that we have sort of extracted from these words and made words like teenager out of, because if you're 13 to 19, you're a teenager, and that's where we get it from, right? But where did this teen thing come from? This teen thing is not a random set of sounds, okay? It comes from somewhere, and if you look closely, you may start to realize that it looks like another number, and that is 10. You just take out one of the E's, and teen becomes 10, and as it turns out, that is not a random connection, because teen does just come from the Old English word for 10. So really, 13 just means 3 plus 10. 14 just means 4 plus 10. And no, we're not going to do the rest of the teens here because they all have the same basic etymology once you understand how it works. All right, so what's going on with the number 10 here? Because we have an extra E in there, so the spelling is different, but then we also have a difference in pronunciation. We say teen and not 10. We don't say 310, 410, 510. Whatever, we say 13, 14, 15. So both the spelling and the pronunciation are different. What's going on? Spelling is oftentimes a clue in the English language to something going on with the etymology, even if the spelling doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense anymore. Although in this case, it still does a little bit because the two E's tell us that this is a long vowel. It's 13 and not 13. Even though today in English we don't necessarily enunciate long vowels longer than short vowels, they do have a different quality to them, teen instead of 10, right? But in older stages of English, Middle English, Old English, long vowels really were long. They were pronounced long. And then those long vowels underwent what we call the Great Vowel Shift about 500 years ago, where anything that was pronounced tain with a long A sound, which would have been written two E's to show it was a long E, it changed its quality to E instead of A. So 10 became teen, and that's actually why we pronounce this teen instead of tain or 10. However, short vowels did not undergo the Great Vowel Shift in the same way. So 10, the number 10, used to be long in prehistory because if you recall, it used to be 2 syllables, tehun, and then the H contracted, and you got a long vowel there because that was 2 vowels becoming 1 long vowel. But then it shortened up, and so it did not undergo the Great Vowel Shift in the same way that teen did. And so it spelled with 1 E. It still said 10 instead of teen or something like that. Whereas here, we didn't get the shortening, and it did undergo the Great Vowel Shift, which, as I said, only affected long vowels. So that's why we say 13 and not 13, or rather, we don't say teen for the number 10, we just say 10. But fundamentally, these are the same number, even though it can be a little bit difficult to tell if you're not paying attention because the spelling and the pronunciation are both different now. All right, let's skip over 14 to 19, same story for all of those, and go right on to the number 20. This is going to be a history of the number 20, but also the number 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90, because again, you can pretty much tell what's going on once you understand the last part. So where does 20 come from? 20 comes from the Old English 20. Already in Old English, G's were becoming silent or more like Y sounds. And at the end of a word like this might have already been pronounced with a silent G at the end, but the G was there historically, and in older dialects, it would have been more like 20 with a G there. But you can see how it would be easy for that to fall out. Today, we don't obviously have any relic of the G left. It's just 20. Where does this come from? Well, you might be starting to guess where the first part comes from, because as we've already talked about, the twain part comes from the Old English word for two. So 20 is 2T, 30 is 3T, 40 is 4T. What is going on with the teague? Well, teague was another way of saying 10 in Old English. So really 20 is just two tens. 30 is just three tens, etc. But this begs the question, the same question we asked in the last slide, what is going on with 10 here? Because if teen doesn't really necessarily look like 10, teague really doesn't look like 10, because you have a whole other G there. It just looks totally different. So how does this teague element that became the TY element at the end of our tens, 20, 30, 40, etc., how did this come from 10? This is a little bit more complicated than teen, so hold with me, but we're going to use some of the concepts that we have already been developing in some previous safaris here. Well, just to review, the Proto-Germanic word for 10 was tehun, as I just mentioned, and it comes from the Proto-Indo-European word decum, which meant 10. So far, so good. Nothing too crazy going on there. Now, as you might recall, Grimm's law is what changes that D to a T and what changes that K to a H. But we talked about one, maybe not exception, but extra thing you need to know about Grimm's law, which is that it has something to do with where the stress in the word was placed. Grimm's law occurs if it's at the beginning, if the sound is at the beginning of a word, or if the stress is immediately before it. But if the stress is not immediately before it and the sound is not at the very beginning of the word, we're going to need to have another law apply called Werner's law, which is going to change some of the output of Grimm's law. So remember, this when you just had a word like tehun, the T and the H both would have just undergone Grimm's law or been the output of Grimm's law, and Werner's law would not have applied to either of them because it would have been tehun, and that would have been how it stayed. However, let's say you put tehun in a compound, like you want to say two tens, and you say something like twain tehun, which would have literally been 210, twain tehun. What's going to happen? If you have the stress on the beginning of the word twain, it's no longer on tehun at all. Something's going to happen to that H specifically in tehun. Werner's law is going to apply because the stress is no longer right before it. And Werner's law says that H's become G's. So twen tehun would have become something like twen tigun with a G instead of an H there, and then the ending would have fallen off, and you get 20. So basically, this is just Werner's law in action. That's how you get what looks like an anomalous form of the word 10 there in 20 with that G, but it actually all makes sense once you understand how Grimm's and Werner's law worked. All right, let's move on. We're going to keep going to bigger numbers. Let's move on to 100. 100 is a really fascinating word in the Indo-European languages, and we're going to spend most of the rest of our time here in this safari looking at the word 100 because it's really one of the best attested words across all of the Indo-European subgroups, languages, dialects, and so by studying it, we can actually learn a lot about how we reconstruct diverse historical forms and how we try to come to one particular proto-form when the data seems to be pulling us in all different directions. So let's start closer to home. And by closer to home, I mean closer to home for an English speaker like me and like you, I assume, because you're watching this. So we have the word 100 in modern English, but let's go back to older Germanic languages like Old English. In Old English, the word for 100 was just hund. In Gothic, which is the oldest Germanic language that we have record of, it's hunda. So you might notice something is missing there. Right off the bat, the second syllable of 100 is not there in the older forms. And there's a reason for that, because red actually just comes from an older Germanic word that means count. So the original word for 100 in the Germanic languages was not 100, it was hund, with just that first syllable. And then the red was added later for whatever reason to say 100 count. It's a little bit redundant because you don't really need to say you're counting 100 because it's a number, so you know what you're doing. But that's what happens. So the red part is not an original part of what we're trying to reconstruct here. And the Old English and Gothic data help us with that. The Gothic data also tells us that there was probably another syllable on the end of this word originally. We're going to worry about that down the road, and it's not too big of a deal. So if we're trying to use this data to reconstruct a Proto-Indo-European form. As you know by now, we have to undo Grimm's law to get back to the Proto-Indo-European form of what 100 might have looked like. So if we undo Grimm's law, what would this data suggest? Now remember, H's come from K's, so let's start with a K, and then D's can come from a couple of different things depending on if Werner's law applied or not, and that's going to depend in turn on where the stress was in the word. All right. So if the word for 100 in Proto-Indo-European was stressed on the first syllable, then the D comes from a DH sound, and the word would be kunda, or something like that, just looking at the Germanic data. However, if the stress was on the last syllable, then Werner's law is going to apply, and that D actually comes from a T, so it's going to be kunta. So far, we can say that the word for 100 looks something like either kunda or kunta in Proto-Indo-European, depending on the placement of the accent or stress, which we don't necessarily know yet just from the Germanic data. By the way, we're not worrying about the rest of the word yet. I just wanted to undo Grimm's law here, and we're going to worry about the rest of the word here on the next slide. So let's look at the word for 100 in other Western Indo-European languages. Let's go a little further from home, linguistically speaking, and look at other words for 100 in other related languages to Germanic that are a little further afield. Let's look at two forms from the Celtic languages, Old Irish and Middle Welsh. In Old Irish, the word for 100 was Kate. By the way, these C's are all going to be hard. So these are K sounds we're dealing with, regardless of what it might look like. So Old Irish, the word for 100 was Kate. In Middle Welsh, it was Kant. Now, if we put those two together, we are probably going to reconstruct a form in Proto-Celtic, in other words, the earliest Celtic language that did have an N there. So Old Irish lost the N, and Welsh did not lose the N. And again, we won't worry too much about the vowel, but we're probably going to reconstruct a vowel there. A subgroup of Indo-European that's pretty closely related to Celtic is Italic, which includes Latin. Latin was an Italic Indo-European language. So if we go to Latin and see what the word for 100 was in Latin, it's centum. So it looks a lot like the Celtic forms, as you can see. It does have the N there, and it also has an ending, which we guessed the word for 100 would have a second syllable that was an ending based on the Germanic data. And look, there it is right there in Latin. By the way, we get words like cent, like 1 cent, a denomination of money, which means 100th, from the Latin word centum. And of course, Spanish, French, the Romance languages all get their words for 100 from the Latin word centum. And we get words like percent. Percent means per 100 from the Latin word for centum. So there's a lot going on just with that etymology. Okay, so how do these forms from the Celtic and Italic languages help us with the Germanic data that we were just looking at on the last screen? Well, first of all, notice that all three of these have a T here and not some kind of D or whatever the outcome of DH would have been in these languages. So that tells us something very important, and that helps us to clear up something that we weren't sure about when we were looking at the Germanic data, and that is that, yes, Werner's law did apply to this. T is the original consonant that was here, and therefore we can guess something very important about the word for 100 in Indo-European. It was not pronounced dun-dun with the stress on the first syllable. It was pronounced dun-dun with the stress on the second syllable. And we're going to fill in the gaps a little bit of what it would have sounded like. But regardless, we can be pretty sure that it starts with a K, because Germanic, Celtic, Latin all agree that it starts with a K once you work with Grimm's law and the Germanic data. We can be sure that there was an N in there or some kind of nasal, and then we can be sure there was a T, and then there looks like there was a syllable at the end. All right. What about that vowel in between the K and the N that we're getting here? Notice that sometimes it's an A, sometimes it's an E. It was a U in the Germanic data. What's going on? Now, vowels can be pretty inconsistent when we are trying to figure out what they were 6,000 years ago, but this vowel is so inconsistent that we think that there actually was not originally a vowel here. Rather, this was one of those syllabic nasals. In other words, a sound like or that is its own vowel and consonant kind of at the same time. So this is what we reconstruct. We actually reconstruct a syllabic nasal. So we say kntome. Now, again, don't worry too much about the om ending, but you'll just have to take my word on it that Latin is giving us a pretty good window into what the ending of the word for 100 probably would have been. Pretty similar. It probably ended in an M with a vowel before it. So based on everything we've seen so far, we're going to come up with a word like kntome in Proto-Indo-European for the word 400. Now let's check our work. Let's keep going and look at more data that's even further afield from other Indo-European languages that aren't as closely related to Germanic, that maybe aren't from Western Europe, but are still part of the Indo-European family. Let's look at Greek. Now, Greek, you might be like, wait a minute, Greek is a European language. of the Indo-European family, so surely it can't be that far afield from Latin or any of the Germanic languages or Celtic. But when you actually understand the linguistic history of the Indo-European family, Greek is actually not that closely related to the Western Indo-European languages, and there's a lot of reasons for this. But that even though Greece is part of Europe, Greek is part of a more central group of Indo-European languages. So if it looks similar, that's going to be some good confirmation that we're on the right track. All right. So the Greek word for 100 is hekaton, and the accent or stress is on the last syllable, which is exactly where we've been saying, but there's something weird going on, this he at the beginning. Well, as it turns out, and we actually mentioned this in a recent safari, the word for one in Greek was hen. And so just like in English, the red part was added to mean 100 count, in Greek, the he or hen originally part was added to mean 100. The katon part is actually the 100 part. So let's chop the he off. We don't need to worry about it. We just got katon here in Greek. As you can see, it actually looks very similar to the kanton thing that we just reconstructed on the last slide, except you have this a or alpha there where we would expect the and there's no trace of an n. That's because in Greek there was a sound law where they actually just turned all the and the those syllabic nasals into alphas. They said, forget about it. We're just turning them into alphas because it's easier to say. So that alpha there between the K and the T is exactly what we would expect for a syllabic nasal. So this actually confirms our reconstruction of canton. So looking good so far. Let's go way to the east from another language that's still in the Indo-European family, but is not closely related to really anything else that we've been looking at, and that is Tocharian. In Tocharian, the word for 100 is Kante. Looks great. It's got the K, it's got the N, it's got the T, it's got another syllable. Okay, so it definitely seems to have everything that we've been looking for, which is good news because Tocharian split off from Indo-European really early on in its history and went east. Tocharian was a language spoken in what is now Western China, which is not a place that you might expect an Indo-European language to have been spoken. But it was there. We found their texts. They're extinct. They are not there anymore. You cannot go to China and still find Tocharians. But they were there maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, living along the Silk Road. You may know of the Silk Road, which runs through Central Asia. They spoke an Indo-European language that, again, had developed quite a bit from the rest of them, most of which ended up in Europe and South Asia. So it's great that Tocharian gives us some more confirmation of the fact that Canton is looking like a pretty good reconstruction for 100, because if they left all those years ago and went their own ways, they couldn't have been keeping their story straight with anybody else. So the fact that they have a word that looks very similar, we should be able to pat ourselves a little bit on the back when we look at this data. Okay, let's keep going and look at the word for 100 in some other Central Indo-European languages that are somewhere between Greek and Tocharian on the map. Now, let's look at this data and then we'll talk about it. Old Church Slavic, which is the oldest Slavic language that we have written down. Slavic languages are spoken in Eastern Europe today and include things like Russian, most notably. The word for 100 in these languages all starts with an S and not a K. So we have Sato in Old Church Slavic. If we go to the South Asian Indo-European languages, such as Avestan, which is the oldest Iranian language that we have written down, it's Satam. And if we go to Sanskrit, which is the oldest language of India that we have written down, it's Shatam with the accent on the second syllable, which is where we expected. But still, notice all three of these have a pretty glaring problem from the perspective of our reconstruction. They all start with an S. There's no K sound in sight. At least we have the T. At least we have the two syllables. So everything else looks okay. But the fact that there's an S there instead of a K is not what we would expect based on what we've been looking at so far. Well, how do we account for this data? As it turns out, this is part of a very well understood sound law in the Central Indo-European dialects, whether it's the dialects of what's now Iran, India, Eastern Europe, the Slavic countries. These all were part of a Central Indo-European group that underwent a mutation or sound law. It didn't happen in languages that were further west or further east, like English, Tocharian, Greek, Latin, Celtic, whatever. And according to the sound law, most of the K sounds in these languages became some kind of S sound. So notice it's a different S sound in those three. So in Sanskrit, that S with the accent mark over it is like a sh sound. It's not really a s sound, but it's some kind of S sound. So all of these have a sound law that because palatalize, that's our technical linguistic term, they palatalize from k to sh. And again, This happened all over the language. This did not just happen in the word for 100, although this is one of the most obvious places you can see it. It happened all over the language. And so whenever we're comparing a word with K in Latin or Greek to a word in Sanskrit, let's say, and we're trying to find some kind of connection between them, that word is probably going to start with an S sound in Sanskrit or in Russian, even, or any of these more central dialects. We actually call them satem languages, these languages that underwent this mutation from K to S. We call them satem languages after this word. So this word is actually pretty important as we're trying to understand the differences between these Indo-European dialects. Let's look at the word for 100 in two more central Indo-European languages. These languages are Latvian and Lithuanian. These are from the Baltic subfamily, which is closely related to the Slavic subfamily. They're called Baltic because, of course, they're spoken near the Baltic Sea in northeastern Europe, in today the countries of Latvia and Lithuania. Notice they have the S's, although in Lithuania it's a sh sound, but it's still an S kind of sound. So they've clearly undergone this central mutation from K to S that we now understand. The rest of it looks pretty much like we would expect, except for one weird thing. And I'll let you look at it, see if you can figure out the weird thing that we would not expect from our reconstruction of the word for 100 so far in the Indo-European languages. As you can see, there's an M creeping in somewhere here that we would not have expected, because all we've seen so far in all of the other languages are N's or just U's, like in Greek and Sanskrit, where there's just an A there instead of any kind of nasal consonant at all. But in Latvian and Lithuanian, we actually have an M instead of an N, which is not what we would have expected from any of the other data. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on with the M? On the one hand, did these two closely related Baltic Indo-European languages have a mutation, a sound law, where for some reason they changed the N to an M? They're both right next to each other. They probably got it from each other or from a common ancestor. Nobody else had this. And so if that's the case, we don't need to worry about it. It's just something weird going on in the Baltic languages that they, for some reason, changed the N to an M, and everyone else left it N, so we're going to reconstruct an N as the protoform. That is one way of looking at it, that they're outvoted by all the other data. So who cares what they think, because they're just two small languages on the Baltic Sea, and all the other data outvotes them. However, from a linguistic perspective, we should think of it from a different way of looking at this, and that is, what if the M is original? And you might be like, okay, well, if the M is original, what all of the other dialects really changed it to an N, and then these guys are the only ones who are more conservative? And the answer is maybe. And the reason is that in linguistics, there's a process we've talked about called assimilation, which is one sound becoming more like something that it is usually next to. In this case, the T is what's next to the M or the N. T is a sound that we call a dental consonant. It's made with your tongue up behind your teeth, essentially. N is also a dental nasal. You have your tongue right there. And M is a nasal, but it's not dental at all. You use your lips to make an M. So it would make a lot of sense for an M to assimilate to an N right before a T, because it wants to be more like the T. You don't have to move your tongue and your lips as much to say NT than to say MT. In fact, sometimes if you're being lazy and you say a word with MT, it'll come out as NT, even if you don't notice it. However, if it already was NT, it would be the opposite of making sense for it to change randomly to MT, because that's not what we'd expect through assimilation. So for this reason, linguists actually say the Latvian and the Lithuanian forms are more conservative than all of the rest of the data we've been looking at, because of that basic phonological principle. Therefore, we don't reconstruct kuntom as the word for 100 in Indo-European. We actually reconstruct kuntom. And you can try this. Try this out. Say this to yourself. Maybe if you live with someone, they'll think it's funny that you're saying these ancient words out loud. But just try this, okay? Do a little phonological experiment. Say kuntom really quick. Don't pay attention, and it's probably going to come out as kuntom, because the M will assimilate to the T and become more of an N sound. So we think kuntom was the original conservative way of saying it before assimilation happened. And the only reason we even have a clue that there was an M there is because of these two languages, Latvian and Lithuanian, because that M is long gone in all of the other dialects. So again, this is a little bit of a window into how we do historical linguistics and why it's not always about majority vote. Majority vote does not always win in historical linguistics. Rather, we need to be careful about the principles of linguistics and phonology and other things that we know from languages all over the world. Okay, so great. We've come up with the word for 100 in Proto-Indo-European. It was kuntom. That's probably how it was pronounced. But there's one more connection to make that is going to really bring this full circle back to some other things that we've been looking at in previous videos. You may have noticed that the beginning of the word kumtom is identical to the end of the word for 10 that we reconstructed, which was decum. So they both have this kum syllable there at the end of decum, at the beginning of kumtom. Okay, well, that in and of itself might not be very interesting. That could easily just be a random thing that, doesn't really mean anything. However, there is some evidence from certain Indo-European languages that there used to be another consonant at the beginning of the word for 100. In other words, it wasn't kumtom, it was another consonant followed immediately by a K and then the rest of the word. So what could that consonant have been? One thing we need to take into consideration if we're trying to figure this out is that in Proto-Indo-European, unstressed vowels that didn't have the accent were known to drop out. They would actually drop out pretty consistently. So what if the word at the beginning of kumtom was actually decum, and this word was originally decumtom, but then since the stress was on tome and not decum, once you added the tome, the E would have fallen out of decum and it would have just become decumtom, which is a mouthful. You can imagine why this word would have evolved a little bit, because it's really hard to say decumtom every time you want to say 100. The very first thing that would have happened is that D probably would have gone away, because it's hard to say like that in one consonant cluster. So decumtom would have immediately, or not immediately, but eventually become kumtom without the D there at all. But there is still some evidence it was still being said in earlier Indo-European languages, all right? So if this was decumtom and it really had decum there, which is the Indo-European word for 10, what would this word have originally meant? Well, tome is just a derivational ending. In other words, it derives, it says it's connected to the first part in some way, shape, or form. So what would decumtom mean if that was the original form of 10? It probably would have meant something like 10 tens. In other words, you have 1 10, 2 tens, that's 20, 3 tens, that's 30, all the way to 10 tens, and that's 100. It could have meant something like the 10th 10, but that's obviously very similar to 10 10. So either way, the original foundational fundamental meaning of the word for 100 in Indo-European was derived from the word for 10. It was not an independent number. It was not an independent word. It was straight up derived from 10, which makes sense because 10 would have been the foundation for the number system in these very ancient cultures. And if you wanted to make bigger numbers, they would usually just be derived from those basic numbers. And we can see the derivation in action here, that you start with the word for 10, you count 10 of those, you get 100, but the word for 100 really just means 10 tens because everything is sort of base 10 in these systems. We're going to see this also with the word for 1,000 as we get to bigger numerals. Obviously, we're going to skip 200, 300 because they're very obvious as to where they come from. So let's go to the next biggest one, 1,000. 1,000 also is connected to these words that we've been looking at. It comes from the Proto-Germanic thusundi. So obviously it hasn't changed that much in over 2,000 years from thusundi to 1,000. But where does thusundi come from? It probably was originally a collocation of two words, thus and hund. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know where hund comes from. Hund is the Old Germanic word for 100. That's all that means. What about the thus part? We think thus comes from the Indo-European root that means to swell or to be large. It was teu, and then Grimm's Law happened, so the T became a th. No big deal there. So if you put those two parts together, what would thus hundi mean? It would literally mean it's a swollen 100, or maybe a little more metaphorically, it's just a big 100. So interestingly, 100, the word for 100 comes from the word for 10, but the word for 1,000 comes from the word for 100. So you can see that everything's just being derived up the scale as we go bigger and bigger with the numbers. Now, why would this be the case? The truth is that if you're living in a pastoral society 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, like the Proto-Indo-Europeans, you don't need names for numbers that are really that big. How many times are you going to need to count past 100? Not that often. If you're really, really rich, you have 100 cattle, right? And 1,000 would have just been a giant amount to them. I mean, you would have been a crazy robber baron magnate of that time if you had 1,000 of anything, right? So they just didn't need big numbers. And of course, money in the modern sense hadn't been invented yet either. So nobody had bank accounts. Nobody had $1,000. Nobody had 1,000 of anything probably. So you just didn't need these names for big numbers. And so by the time much later on, cultures started to evolve the need to say these bigger numbers, they didn't necessarily have them ready, and so they just derived them from the smaller numbers. If they needed a word for 1,000, they just said, oh, it's a big 100, or whatever you want to call it. It comes from that basic meaning that they would have already had. We can tell that Proto-Indo-European probably didn't have a set word for thousand because in other Indo-European languages, it comes from a totally different root. So in Latin, the word for thousand is mille, and in Greek, it's kilioi. Now, interestingly, we think there is a connection between mille and kilioi, even though they don't really look that much alike. But either way, they're not connected to thousand at all. So when Indo-European broke up, there doesn't seem to have been one agreed upon way to say 1,000 because they just didn't need that number like they needed 8 or even 100 or something like that. 100 was probably the biggest one that they had that they all agreed on what that number was going to be because they needed it. This is even more true if we keep going up the scale to million. You can imagine that if they didn't necessarily need the number 1,000 all the time, they could have barely conceived of the word million. And so, not surprisingly, the word million is not native to Germanic. It hasn't really been in English for very long at all because, again, how often did people need this word? How often did people really need this concept? So where does million come from? It comes from Italian, just like zero. We got it in the Middle Ages from Italian, milione. And where did Italian get it from? Well, there was something on the last slide that we saw. Remember, Latin had the word 1,000. It was mille. In million actually just is a derivation of 1,000. So million literally means a big thousand or 1,000,000 or something like that. That's basically what million means. But again, there was not originally a number for this in Indo-European because they just didn't need it. And so they had to derive it from these smaller numbers. So million comes from 1,000, 1,000 comes from 100, 100 comes from 10. And so you can see it really all goes back to that countdown. We're circling back around to that countdown that we were just looking at in the last 2 episodes of Word Safari. I probably don't need to tell you that billion is just by million, 2, right? It's the second order. Trillion is just tri-million, 3, and it just goes up from there. So as you can see, as the numbers get bigger, we don't really get any more creative with how we are deriving them. All right, that's it. That's all the numbers we're going to talk about. I think that pretty much covers our basis. If you have any other comments, if you have any questions, if you can think of numbers that don't derive from any of these numbers that we've already talked about, go ahead and comment below. See you next time.